So in the previous section, you saw how we could take an index template and get it loaded into our application template. But that begs the question, how do we load the about template into our application template? And how would we also map that to a URL so when somebody goes to our application/about, it would load up the correct template? To do this, we're going to need the Ember router. And we're going to use the symbol of the tree trunk whenever we see the router, because it translates a path into a route. And like a tree trunk, all requests start here. The Ember framework is made up of many components. We've already introduced the handlebars template, which sits down here. And now we've talked about the Ember router, which sits pretty close to the browser request because it figures out the route name for each request coming in. Here we are back in our app.js. This is where all of our custom JavaScript goes to build our Ember application. And as you can see up there at the top, we have our Ember application. Now let's build a router. To start defining routes in our application, we simply write app router map and pass in an anonymous function. Every page in our website will be defined by the router. So what do we need to add to the router when our browser goes to visit the About page and we want to render out the About template? To do this, we write this.route and send in the About string as an argument. What this tells our application is that when our browser visits the About path, we want our Ember application to render the About route. And thus, when an outlet is found inside of our application template, to go ahead and load the About template inside of it. Now if we jump into our browser and we visit the About page, we'll notice that we get About the Fire Sprites. The proper template has been loaded. You might also notice that down below in Developer Tools, it printed out Transitioned into About because of our log transitions true option that we sent into our application. You might be wondering, what's going on with that weird hash sign that happens after the domain name? Could we go to our domain name /about? Would that work? Well, no. If we went there, it would say web page not found. That's because there's no about/index.html or about.html path that our application knows about. That's because in ember.js, our entire application and all the HTML it needs to render is getting loaded through one file, the index.html file. And that's what gets loaded when we go to example.com. It doesn't matter what page we load, whether it's the home page, about page, or product list page, we will have first loaded the index.html page because that contains all of the templates. Just to reiterate, when our browser accesses our Ember application, the first thing it does is it sends over all the templates into the client, into the browser. Then at that point, it goes and loads up individual templates to display something on the screen. In this case, it's loading the application template and then the About template. In case you haven't caught on yet, that hash tells our browser that everything after this is not part of the file path. That information will get passed into Ember so we can figure out, what templates to render. But as far as our browser is concerned, it's going to load the root path and load up that index.html file. If we didn't have that hash, well, our application would error out because there is no file path in our app. If we followed a more complex path, like you see here, it's going to load up the store file path on our server, maybe look for a store.html, and then if that's an Ember application, it might look at the remainder of the URL to load the shopping cart route. Let's get back to our About route. Remember, it looks something like this. Now when our browser goes to this URL, the file path it loads up is none because it's going to load up our index.html if this is the first time we visited this page. The path it's going to load is /about, and that's going to map to the route of About. But what if we want to override this default behavior and maybe go to the About Us Ember path and load the About route. How might we do that? Ember makes this really easy, and we can do this by sending in a new object to the route which specifies path about us. Now, when we go to this URL, it'll look up the Ember path about us, which will load the About route and properly load up our About page. Now you might be wondering, do we need to add an index route? So when someone goes to the base URL, it loads up the blank Ember path and then maps that to the index route. The code might look something like this, you might think. It turns out we don't need this code at all. The default behavior in Ember is to load the index template, which is why earlier when we had our home page and we were loading up the index template, we didn't need a router at all. So now if we jump back into the browser, you'll notice when we click on the About link, the URL changes to #/about, and then we can click on Home, which again loads up the index route. Now it's time for you to add a new route, and I'll see you in the next level. This web app, which is on our web application. Web application. Is it I don't know.